this on? Can you hear me at the back? Hello? While we're getting settled, I'll begin with the first of what will, I'm sure, be many Summer Institute announcements from Lisa Hill-Corley and Nancy Knock. Kevin Hoover, Tom Humphrey, and Dick Timberlake, you would need to fill out W-9 forms for us at the table. So if you could do that, that would be terrific. All international presenters, we do need to, Nancy Knock needs to see you, and we hope you have a passport with you. We're going to continue along the theme of today, which is financial crises historically considered, with Professor Leland Yeager. Leland is a professor emeritus at Auburn University, but I want to mention as well that he spent much of his career in Virginia and at UVA. He's also been then one of the important members of that Virginia School of Political Economy. From 1957 through 1984, he was at UVA, and he's, of course, an emeritus professor of UVA. He's going to speak to us today about the continuing search for a monetary constitution. So please welcome Leland Yeager.
Thank you, Sandra. The directors of the conference asked me to take off from a series of lectures delivered at UVA in 1960 and published under the title In Search of a Monetary Constitution in 1962. Some of the lecturers must have been working on their papers literally half a century ago. Now, of the lectures, only one was squarely in favor of privatized money. That idea had not received much publicity back in 1960. And the speaker in favor of privatized money was Murray Rothbard, who envisaged a gold standard with money issued by private banks and backed 100% by gold reserves. Another speaker advocated a gold standard pretty much of the pre-1914 type. Jim Buchanan, I won't say he advocated, but he introduced as a useful way of thinking, he introduced the idea of a brick standard, which is a commodity supposedly in extremely relative price elastic supply and demand both. Wilfred King advocated open market operations to stabilize the price index. Viner was pretty skeptical about any simple monetary rules or structure of a monetary authority. Friedman spoke against a commodity standard and also, strangely, against an independent central bank. The idea of an independent central bank has become very popular nowadays. Clark Warburton reviewed the history of monetary disturbances in the United States. He was an early, even before Friedman, monetarism. And Clarence Philbrook discussed a couple of technical points, but important points in monetary theory. Well, since the 1960 lectures, we've had a lot of new experience in reality and in theory. Oh, we've experienced fixed exchange rates, which collapsed into floating exchange rates. We've experienced inflation and the pains in the early 1980s of disinflation. We experienced in the 70s the phenomenon of stagflation. We've introduced a lot of financial innovation, including money market mutual funds. We could go down the list, checkable savings accounts, checkable credit union accounts, innovations which have fuzzed up the very notion of what counts as money. So if we were to direct the central bank to keep money growing at a steady rate, we would be hard put to say just what is it that we want to keep growing at a steady rate. In academia, we have seen a lot of innovation too. Back in 1960, we were still in the days when a rather crude Keynesianism was the dominant theory. We evolved to monetarism, and then beyond monetarism to the new classical economics, which seemed to be predicated on the idea that markets equilibrate themselves almost automatically and dependably. And the exaggeration of that line of thinking was the real business cycle theories, that business cycles are not monetary phenomena, they're caused by real changes in technology or tastes. Now, it seems to me that business booms and busts are historical phenomena, and we can't count on having a predetermined theory which accounts for all historical episodes. If the real business cycle theorists want to convince us, they ought to specify just what were these big technological or taste changes that caused particular episodes of depression. Now we have gotten to the stage where the fashion is dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium theory. The more sensible kind of theory, I think, is what is called the new Keynesianism, which might just as well be called the new monetarism. It's a blend, really, of monetarism plus recognition of the impediments in the real world from keeping markets clearing automatically and promptly. It recognizes the various facts of price and wage stickiness. Now, these are realities, and the theory ought to be able to account for them. But it seems to me that the most prestigious kind of theory these days is inventing imaginary worlds and then exploring the properties of these imaginary worlds. People who engage in that sort of economics, sure, are unable to explain the present crisis. It's sort of lowbrow to talk about the real world when you can have impressive imaginary worlds to talk about. Now, as for the lessons of the current crisis, it, like most recessions, should be looked at as an episode of discoordination. When markets are working at their best, the plans of literally billions of people around the world mesh fairly well. The pressures of supply and demand on markets set prices, and trade relations in such a way that the plans of the people pretty well fit together. What I mean is epitomized by a story of Bastiat and then Wilhelm Roock. Imagine the job of provisioning a large city with all the goods and services that the residents demand, and all the intermediate steps that are involved in bringing the goods and services to the final consumer. A tremendous planning process. If it were to be planned centrally, it would be a tremendously difficult task. And yet, market processes somehow or other ordinarily bring the plans of all these different suppliers of goods and services, including the intermediate goods that go into producing them, together. But This seems to me to be a reason for the primacy of microeconomics ahead of macroeconomics, in order to discuss what could go wrong with this problem, with this process of rather automatic coordination. In order to understand what could go wrong, we first got to understand how it goes right. In order to understand disruptions, what is it that's being disrupted? Well, the trouble is a non-market clearing pattern of relative prices or a general price and wage level that is out of line with the flows and quantities of money and credit. The difficulty in a depression could be a major real change. I mean, theoretically or imaginably, it could be a change in technology or tastes. But as a matter of historical reality, most of the recessions have been caused by monetary disorder. Today's crisis didn't originate in too little spending, but in excessive spending. We had all sorts of government programs to promote easy mortgages and easy finance for buying houses, even by people at the stage of their lives where they were not financially ready to buy houses. The invention of government programs to promote cheap home ownership goes way back, at least back to the 1930s. It's an accumulation of piecemeal bright ideas on the part of politicians, little mortgage guarantees, subsidies, tax advantages that add up to really an uncoordinated pattern of government intervention. It's, I think, what Jim Buchanan just now called constitutional failure. And then, of course, we've had easy money, not only in the United States, but around the world. The Economist magazine had been warning for years against excessively easy money. Now, the temporary spike in oil prices might have had something to do with the current recession, but I think the main emphasis in this particular historical episode is a housing boom and collapse which impinged on an already fragile financial system with its newfangled derivatives, credit default swaps and that sort of thing, the vogue for mathematical models on Wall Street to estimate risk, faulty assessments of risk for that and other reasons, and perverse pay incentives where, as the anecdote goes, a pizza delivery boy could become a mortgage broker, that is to say, would get big pay for drumming up people to borrow money, get the money out the door. That was what brought rewards. And then when the bubble collapsed, after all, houses can't keep on rising in price forever. I think it was Herb Stein who once said, or introduces a kind of rule, that things that cannot continue forever will at some point stop. Our present situation illustrates a contrast in economics of which there are several examples. And I mean the contrast between what is true or desirable in the short run and what is true or desirable in the long run. For example, an easy money policy in the short run will depress interest rates. But if it is continued, then through the price inflation that it causes and the allowance for the price inflation in the nominal interest rate, the interest rate will rise. In other words, abundant money creation will depress interest rates in the short run and raise interest rates in the long run. Well, we now see we are now getting into the longer run consequences of a short run stimulus to spending. In the short run now, we have fallen into the situation where the difficulty seems pretty much the opposite of what we've had in the past few years. Too much spending has turned into what looks like too little spending. And politicians now call for and enact legislation for economic stimulus, get spending going. Our local congressman in Alabama, and I'm sure there are others who have the same idea, were in favor of giving consumers monetary incentives to buy a car quick. And if you buy it, say, within the next 3 months, you would get a $7,500, I'm not sure whether it was tax credit or deduction on your income tax. He didn't make that perfectly clear in his letter to constituents. But if you were to delay, say, for 6 months in buying a new car, then your reward would be only $5,000. And if you delayed beyond that, you'd get only $2,500 incentive. Well, again, the field is open for bright ideas on how to spend money. The trouble is that the government deficit and the national debt has been run up tremendously, and then we also have, of course, the huge expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. It has leveled off in the past several months, but he's leveled off at well over twice what it had been before, and bank reserves have multiplied much more even than that. Well, when the recession comes to an end, confidence is restored, and the banks start lending out their excess reserves, and the ordinary textbook process of the money multiplier comes into effect, we're in danger of having severe monetary and price inflation, it seems to me. Recently, there was an article by Roy Cordato in the Freeman magazine to the effect that all this deficit spending doesn't put a burden on future generations. His theme was that the burden falls on us today. If resources are used in a particular way today, then the resources are used today. There's no way to use today resources that would otherwise be available for people in the future. In other words, he was repeating the exact fallacy that Jim Buchanan demolished in his book of 1957. It's sort of funny, though, that Cordato was using the economist's pre-1957 line as if it was a line in favor of somehow free market policy. Oh, I wanted to mention one other contrast between what's good in the short run or true in the short run and in the long run, and that is the problem of moral hazard. Looked at from the immediate point of view, rescuing Bear Stearns, rescuing long-term capital management back in 1998 might have seemed like a good thing. Check the contagion. But in the long run, it creates the problem of moral hazard. People come to expect to be rescued and take correspondingly larger risks. Speaking of contagion, it seems to me that there are two types at work in the current crisis. First of all, there is the structural inflation, structural contagion, you might call it, where institutions are we're interdependent, where they hold obligations of other institutions. That's in the nature of the financial intermediation, the business of borrowing on the one hand in order to be able to lend on the other hand, borrowing short at low interest rates in order to be able to lend at medium or long term at higher interest rates. But this means that institutions are very highly leveraged, that their liabilities come pretty close to equaling their total assets, so that the capital margin is small and subject to being wiped out. Now, if one financial firm is holding a lot of obligations of others, let's say mortgage-backed bonds, and the value of these bonds goes down, well then the assets of a company holding these bonds goes down, and its capital is in danger of getting wiped out, and firms holding the assets of this company are therefore find a decline in the value of their assets. I won't ramble on about that anymore, except to say that with these interdependent claims, with this whole chain of claims depending on other claims, the situation is fragile and it's likely to come apart. And the other kind of contagion is what I would call psychological contagion. There is the fact that economic activity in general and financial intermediation in particular depends on trust or confidence, and that once confidence is shaken and people and firms hold back on trusting one another, especially on lending to one another, then the flow of credit and, credit can shrivel in some sectors. The deterioration of confidence shows up probably in an exaggerated way on the stock market, and then the collapse of the stock market itself is a further reason for confidence to decline. Back in the late summer, I'm going to make a confession. I have deviated from free market orthodoxy, but back in the late summer of 2008, I realized that the crisis had changed from being fascinating to being scary. And I thought that something ought to be done to relieve the psychological contagion. Something like, TARP, that if only the government would firmly guarantee or possibly even buy the temporarily depressed assets of important holders, then it might check the panic, that the very announcement of any plausible would check the psychological contagion. Now, I had this thought and made this recommendation not as an economist, certainly not as an economist, but as a very amateur psychologist. But that kind of recommendation, of course, was predicated on getting simple, agreed, decisive, credible action from the government. And you just can't get that sort of thing from a democratic government or from any government. Anyway, we have gotten to a situation where it is more important than it was back in 1960 to think about a revised monetary constitution. I worry about destruction of the dollar, as this tremendous multiplication of bank reserves, which will be activated when the crisis abates and confidence returns, as it will. These reserves can be activated. The ordinary money supply can, however exactly you measure it, and I admit that there's no precise agreed measure of the money supply anymore, but however it is measured, it'll go up. And then I do worry about extreme inflation. Now, maybe the Federal Reserve will be clever enough and politically astute enough to implement an exit strategy, so-called, to undo the great expansion of bank reserves before the inflation destroys the dollar. But just in case, I think we ought to be prepared with ideas of what to do in case the dollar is destroyed. And even if the dollar should somehow escape inflationary destruction, there is a point made by Benjamin Friedman of Harvard, namely that in ordinary times, I mean, apart from the times when, like now, banks are holding massive excess reserves, in ordinary times, the bank reserves, which is what the central banks manipulate in order to try to control money and price conditions, these bank reserves, the thing that the Federal Reserve operates on, is becoming relative to the vast volume of near monies smaller and smaller. So the central banks are going to try to manipulate the whole macroeconomy with some kind of lever on a very small reserve base, with the lever becoming more and more rubbery. Benjamin Friedman predicted that banking as we know it and monetary policy as currently conducted can't last more than about another quarter century. Let's recognize that our current monetary system is absurd. Our unit of account, the unit in which we conduct our pricing, our accounting, government taxing, borrowing and lending for long-term as well as short, this unit of account is nothing more definite than the fleeting value of the scruffy dollar bill. It's absurd that the government can borrow trillions of dollars payable in nothing more definite than money which it can print itself if need be. To talk about monetary reform, I hope I'm not rambling too long, to talk about monetary reform, we should recognize the determinants, the requirements of any monetary system. The main one of these is determinacy. At any one time, the value of the monetary unit, the value of the dollar, ought to have some determinate value. That is to say, it should have some anchor. The value of the dollar shouldn't drift unanchored and in a self-reinforcing way up or down. An example of an indeterminate monetary system would be, say, a gold standard where the dollar is always redeemable, not in a definite quantity of gold, but in a dollar's worth of gold. And so if you have inflation, well then the number of dollars that an ounce of gold can redeem goes up and up and up, and you don't have any anchor to the system. Now there are two ways, or a hybrid of the two ways, of providing a nominal anchor to the system, or what Schumpeter called the critical figure of any monetary system, that is determinate. The first way is control over some nominal quantity, such as nominal GDP, or more plausibly, it seems to me, over some quantity of money. If we have a fiat money and the central bank has firm control over the quantity of it, that provides the nominal anchor. The other way is to have redeemability, have the government, have the money unit redeemable in some physical quantity of a substance. Then you see the natural scarcity, so to speak, of the substance, a substance that can't just be printed into existence. The natural scarcity of the substance puts a restraint on how much money can be based at it. On the, let's say, good old days, the dollar was defined as and redeemable in 1.5046 grams of gold. I myself find it easier to think in metric terms than in terms of grains and troy ounces and avoirdupois ounces. It's too complicated. 1.5046 grains of gold. Our current system, of course, is a hybrid. Banks can issue checking account money in competition with one another, but the checking account money has to be ultimately redeemable in federal funds, in currency and deposits in the Federal Reserve banks, which is a quantity that is centrally controlled. Misunderstandings are rampant about interest rate policy, which gets me into the question of whether monetarism and the quantity theory are still relevant today. I would say yes, that we still have to understand the quantity theory in order to understand monetary reform. But, and now maybe this is a little bit too charitable in an interpretation of the quantity theory, or maybe I don't know, maybe I'm extending it beyond what it's supposed to be. But anyway, the quantity theory, as I understand it, doesn't necessarily say that the quantity of money determines the price level, that there is a causation unambiguously running in one way from the quantity of money to the price level. Rather, there is a correspondence between the quantity of money and the price level. I did some research many years ago on the fiat money systems of Austria, Hungary, and Russia when they were considering going on the gold standard in the late 19th century, shifting from their fiat paper to a gold standard currency. Well, of course, one of the main arguments was the gold standard is the most modern monetary system. certainly we don't want to be considered members of the backward countries that haven't yet gone on a gold standard. The other main economic argument, well, that was not an economic argument, that was a prestige argument. The main economic argument seemed to be that the money supply would be automatically determined, that if a country needed more gold, then gold would flow in from abroad. If it had too much money, then the money supply would shrink through gold moving abroad. Now this didn't, the quantity of gold-based money worldwide determined the world price level, but the fact that an individual country was more or less on the receiving end of the world price level and on the receiving end of the corresponding quantity of money is not, it seems to me, a negation of the gold standard. Consider the city of Richmond. The quantity of money held by the firms and people of Richmond is pretty much how much money they demand to hold. And yet, that they demand to hold in view of what incomes and prices are. But that doesn't mean that the quantity theory of money has failed. Now, the current fashion in theory about monetary policy seems to be that everything is done by interest rates. It's true that central banks around the world have given up directly trying to manipulate any quantity of money and have resorted to manipulating the federal funds rate, the short-term overnight rate on loans between banks. I have in my footnote 1 of the main paper listed a sampling of the prestigious literature these days on monetary policy. Perhaps the most admired, let's say, book in this kind of literature is Woodford's book of 2003. And the discussion is pretty much what objectives and what rules should the Federal Reserve follow in manipulating the interest rate. But how does raising or reducing the interest rate change spending? The only way he describes, and it's quite briefly, is if you raise the interest rate, then that makes future goods cheaper relative to present goods, so people postpone their spending. Raising the interest rate reduces current spending. If you lower the interest rate, well, then that's making present goods cheaper in terms of future goods, so people will bring their spending forward in time, do their spending early rather than later. The analysis of Wicksell is widely forgotten. Sure, Wicksell explained how raising or reducing the policy interest rate would restrain or stimulate spending. But it was through changes in the quantity of money that brought about these short-term interest rate changes that policy bit on the real economy. Well, I think I'll just have to skip over. You can read in the paper that's, I think, electronically delivered to you, what I have to say about the status of monetarism today and the empirical grounding of the quantity theory. And I think the quantity theory is a well-grounded theory. Empiricism doesn't mean just numbers. It also means facts of ordinary observation, such as that people hold cash balances, not arbitrarily, but intentionally, to have some idea of how big or how small their cash balances would be, and they act to correct what they consider excessive or insufficient holdings of cash from their own point of view. Cash balances serve as pools into which people receive their incomes and out of which they make their expenditures. And the appropriate size of this pool of cash depends on the flow of income and expenditure on the part of the individual holder. This is an empirical fact, and there are others mentioned in the paper. Now, some proposals for reforming government money or reforming central bank operations are reviewed in the lectures of 1960 that I mentioned. And we could add to them. We could have a gold standard or a commodity reserve standard. We could target on a price level. We could improve on interest rate or quantity rules. The current admired rule is the Taylor rule for manipulating the federal funds rate. Ben McCallum, in recent years, not so much just nowadays, advocated a rule for manipulating the growth rate of the stock of base money in view of recent experience. The growth rate would be modified as recent history seemed to recommend. Newer and more interesting to me are proposals for privatizing money. Now, there are people, particularly associated with the Mises Institute, in my knowledge, who don't want to suggest any definite ideas about what a privatized monetary system would look like. They say, let the market decide. Some of them may conjecture that the market will decide on a monetary system, but who is the market? The market is not some super intelligent being that makes correct judgments. It's a metaphor. I believe Jim Buchanan has sometimes emphasized this, that it's people, men and women, who make economic decisions and take actions. It's not the market. The market is just an arena in which people interact. And it is people with all the fallibilities of human beings that interact on the market. Besides, 5 minutes. Besides, we can't just let the market decide because we've already got centuries of accumulated piecemeal government interventions in our monetary system. If we're going to have a free market system, somehow or other, the current government domination has to be dismantled. And how and at what pace and in what sequence the government interventions are removed is bound to influence the kind of system that will take its place. Some government nudge is just unavoidable then, even if we're in favor of privatized money. I do make a kind of pitch for what some of us call the BFH system after Black, Fama, and Hall. In the paper, that is. I won't repeat the pitch here. I will mention perhaps the chief objection to it is that the idea of indirect redeemability of money, indirect redeemability in some basket of goods and services, is inherently self-destructive. Schnatt and Whitaker, whom I cite in the paper, explain why. They apparently independently rediscovered a point that Knut Wicksell had made way back in 1919. The paper also cited. Wicksell was criticizing a rather absurd book by Benjamin Anderson, which was against the quantity theory. I think Anderson's book could have been demolished in a more direct way. Wicksell's particular argument against the indirect convertibility that Benjamin Anderson had envisaged happened to be wrong. A more specific or more valid difficulty, I think, is one that I have not left myself enough time to describe here, but it is that under the system of indirect redeemability, the commodities defining the dollar are not automatically made more abundant on their own individual markets when money is redeemed. It is really the pressures of rises and falls in the money supply that keep the value of money at its defined value in terms of the unit. But now, if some of the prices in the economy are sticky, resisting monetary pressures, particularly downward, then an accidental rise in the price level, accidental depreciation of the dollar relative to the basket defining it, would cause deflationary pressures on the economy in general, and deflationary pressures working on sticky priced goods and services would tend to depress their economic activity. The point I'm making now is that we need to try to figure out in advance the operational consequences of reforms that we might suggest. As Karl Popper suggested, let our theories die instead of us. That is, to the best we can do it, let's try to think out the consequences of different monetary reforms rather than just simply picking ideas out of the air like the early New Deal did it and see if they work, and if they don't work, then we'll try something else. So I'm not advocating any particular reform. I do have a suggestion, but I'm not confidently advocating any particular reform, but I do think privatized money deserves at least as much academic consideration as it has been getting. I will wind up with a question. If now, 50 years later, we were to have a new series of lectures in search of a monetary constitution, what topics would we put on the list, and whom would we invite to deliver the lectures?
Let me just say that the book that Leland referred to is In Search of a Monetary Constitution, and we're hopeful that perhaps it will be brought back into print at some point. David and I would very much like to see that. It's a wonderful collection, and your question at the end, I think, is fabulous. Who would we invite? We have time
There are two questions here. One is about decriminalizing the use of whatever money contracting parties could agree on. This is really the idea of the denationalization of money that Hayek put forth, I forget how long ago, maybe back in the 1970s. And as for letting the market decide, I would like to repeat my point that the market as such is not a decision-making entity, it is people. And what people decide or what ideas they mull over depends on what ideas have been in circulation, what ideas from academia filter down to the particular level. Therefore, we should try to kill off in advance the bad ideas by investigating their likely operating properties. And the second question has to do with how to avoid moral hazard. Well, you correctly quoted me. I have no answer to that problem. In the short run, particular financial rescues may seem like the least bad way out. As at one time it seemed to me they may be a way of checking psychological contagion, but they create the problem of more and more such rescues being expected in the future, the problem of encouraging riskier and riskier behavior. Sure, you can get rid of the problem of moral hazard by just having a firm guarantee demonstrated to hold in practice of just never rescuing institutions. That takes care of the long run, but it doesn't take care of the short run.
I would just like to follow up on, I don't know if you're a big believer on experimental economics or not, but maybe experimental economics creating one of those imaginary worlds that you were talking about, and just create a fiat money, a central banking environment, and then denationalizing it and see what happens in the experimental setting.
Well, fine, if you can devise experiments like that, more power to you. When I talked about creating imaginary worlds, I wasn't really thinking about devising experimental sessions. I was thinking about the current vogue of mathematical models. Say you invent a world where people live forever, where they have a particular utility function in common. People are acting to maximize the present value of the stream of all their future utilities, with the utility functions being in such a way that the margin utility rises as the logarithm of the goods and services consumed. I confess, I was criticizing that approach to economics, exploring the world of rather preposterous policies. And we could get into discussion of what kind of assumptions it is legitimate to use and what not in an economic model. I can only refer airily at the moment to Alan Musgrave's famous article on assumptions in economic theory.
Let me draw this session to a close. We have yet another paper coming, and so I think we should keep ourselves on schedule. So please join me in thanking Leland Yeager. Very short break, 10 minutes, and then come back to hear Dick and Tom.